Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz, and with us today is a man who needs no introduction, David Friedman. We are going to debate two propositions. The first one is, and he's going to take the affirmative on both. The first one is objectivism is false. And the second one is anarchy is better than limited government. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. David Friedman.
Thank you. My criticism of objectivism is not that all of it is wrong, but that there are two gaping holes, two gaping mistakes in its claims. The first is its bravest and most interesting claim, namely the claim to derive a correct view of right and wrong from facts of reality, to overcome Hume's claim that you could not derive aught from is. The second is the implications she draws from her principles for political philosophy. Let me start. I'm working from Galt's speech, which is a nice summary of her argument. And the first step in Galt's speech is the claim that existence is the value sought by all living things, that creatures cannot act for their own destruction. That happens to be factually false. We know from evolution that insofar as living things are designed for anything, it is reproductive success, not survival. Survival is the means to reproductive success. But we observe that female mammals, including humans, routinely choose to get pregnant. Getting pregnant increases your chance of reproductive success, but decreases your chance of survival. For fairly obvious reasons, especially for humans who until recently had fairly serious problems of deaths in childbirth. There are other more striking examples, but those are enough to make the point that she's claiming to derive things from facts of reality, and her facts of reality happen to be false. Second step is the claim that life and death is in some sense a fundamental value choice. That, as she puts it, a being who does not hold his own life as the motive and goal of his actions is acting on the motive and standard of death. Insofar as that statement is true, it is equally true of any value at all. That is to say, if you don't act to maximize a particular value, whether that's your own life or welfare of humanity or success of your country or whatever else, you are to some limited degree acting against it. But saying that to do anything short of taking the actions that most preserve your life is to act for death is like saying that doing anything short of the actions the utilitarian would recommend is acting for human misery. It makes no sense. There is no argument there. The next step is from life as life to life qua man. And what she claims is not what she seems to be claiming is that in order to act for your life, you must act for your life in a particular way. That, as she says, if existence on earth is your goal, you must choose your actions and values by the standard of that which is proper in man for the purpose of preserving, fulfilling, enjoying the irreplaceable value, which is your life. And she then goes on to some very nice rhetoric about you cannot live as anything else, and the alternative is a state of thing, something unfitting for existing, miserable, and so forth and so on. She's very good at rhetoric, not so good at logic, unfortunately. That insofar as acting in a particular way increases your chance of life, it does so just as much if it is acting in the way that mostly works for humans as if it isn't. So once you've taken your life as the objective, you have to treat preserving, fulfilling, and enjoying as means to that objective, not as separate objectives. And a means cannot trump the objective that is the means for. So the final step is from all of that to objectivist ethics, in particular to the standard libertarian claim that you should not violate other people's rights, put in slightly different language by objectivists, which is a fine claim, but it does not follow from the preservation of your own life, because there will sometimes be circumstances where the act that best serves your life is an act that violates somebody else's rights. Rand tries to special case some of those by calling them lifeboat situations, but it's a much broader problem than that, because if you are acting for your own life, there will occasionally be circumstances where you can, in fact, get away with a violation, where something is available to be stolen and you have almost no chance of being detected, and you have a use for the money. And money that is stolen buys just as much medical service as money that isn't stolen. So the proper conclusion from her argument so far is not you should always respect other people's rights, but you should usually respect other people's rights. That you should be what I like to refer to as a prudent predator, meaning somebody who only violates rights on those perhaps rare occasions when doing so is actually in his interest. But there's no argument to show that such occasions never exist, and therefore no basis for reaching the libertarian conclusion which she wants to reach, which I'm all in favor of her reaching, that you should not violate other people's rights. All right, so that's my basic argument, and my challenge to Michael is that he patch all four of those holes, because as long as one of those holes exists, he can no longer claim that he rationally holds to the conclusions of the argument. He might have a different argument to lead to those conclusions, but not Rand's argument. All right, the second half of my claim, of my criticism of objectivism, is that objectivism, if you accept the conclusion of the argument I've just been criticizing, then the conclusion is not limited government, but anarchy. And the reason is that the basic political principle of the objective ethics is no man may initiate the use of physical force against others. That raises the question of how the limited government that Rand wants is going to pay for things like national defense that you can't sell to customers, because if you defend the country, everybody's defended whether or not they've paid you their share of it. Taxation is an initiation of physical force, so she can't collect taxes. The alternative that one alternative Rand has offered is that you sell the service of using retaliatory force, that you charge people to have their contracts enforced. The problem is that selling something only makes an excess profit above the cost, if you have a monopoly position, if you have some way of preventing competition. That on her principles, either retaliatory force is permitted, is not an initiation of force, which seems reasonable enough, and therefore her government can do it, but so can any private firm that is careful not to violate people's rights. Or it is an initiation of force, in which case her government can't do it either. So that's my basic critique, is that if you accept the idea, the basic principle of objective ethics, that no man may initiate the use of physical force against others, you are led to the conclusion that a limited government must violate rights in order to support itself, either by collecting taxes or by maintaining a monopoly of the services it provides, in particular retaliatory force, which means using force against other people who are not initiating force, namely other competing providers of retaliatory force. That's my argument. I'm supposed to have 10 minutes and I don't see a clock running, but I think this is probably a little less than 10 minutes. And I will now leave it to Michael to try to persuade you that everything I've said is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedman. I am going to draw both on what you've just said and what you've written in the past. If you've changed your mind on something you've written, or if I misstate it, just let me know. So the first thing is you point out, well, the first thing I want to say is that you draw exclusively on Galt's speech and you take quotes from Galt's speech. Now, objectivism is an integrated whole. It's a philosophy that spans metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. So to take quotes from Galt's speech, or even to read Galt's speech in its entirety in a hope to fully understand the entire integration of his objectivism, I think is mistaken from the get-go. Now, let me concede where I think you're right. I think it's an obvious empirical fact that not all living entities, other than humans, always act to maintain their lives. That's obvious. I have no quarrel with it. Now, it's also unequivocal that the concept of value has no meaning divorced from life. Once we have life, you have something that can either stay in existence or go out of existence. If it wants to stay in existence, or if it's a, microbe or some such thing, if it's struggling to stay in existence, however you want to frame it, it has to take certain actions in order to stay alive. The concept of value, which I'll be defining as any object or quality desirable as a means or end in itself. Now, I understand that Ayn Rand defined value as that which you seek to gain and or keep. I think it's an unfortunate definition on her part, but I think if you read the totality of her writings, that is not exactly what she means, because she says you have to have an objective standard to judge whether something is of value or not. Clearly, just seeking to gain or keep something would not meet that criteria. So once you have a living entity, you have things that are good or bad for it. Once you come to the human level, you have a being that has free will, that has to decide to act in its own interest or not act in its own interest, to act to sustain itself or not. Now, obviously, every action that I take is not going to either kill me immediately or keep me alive. But there's many passages within Rand about the person living at a subhuman level who's, basically hobbling along through life, that says that she doesn't mean you're going to die immediately. Only that your actions are either a benefit to your life or a harm to your life. And interesting, in your analysis, in your writing, where you talk about the utilitarian, you say the person doesn't have to take his life or her life as the goal in order to stay alive. You say now to meet utilitarian ethics, you would have to necessarily act to stay alive, or you couldn't act for utility. But you say that once there comes an opportunity to maximize, the hedonic calculus, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, that this person then might take their own life or risk their life, die, whatever. That proves her point. Because up until that point, whatever the stated goal is, that person is acting to keep themselves alive. Now, when the opportunity comes to implement what really matters to them, they die. So that actually proves her point. It doesn't negate it. Now, you talk about the switch from man to man qua man. Now, this is what she actually writes in The Virtue of Selfishness. Man's survival qua man means the terms, methods, conditions, and goals required for the survival of a rational being through the whole of his lifespan in all those aspects of existence which are open to his choice. So the point here is, if I say, that life, human life, is not mere physical survival. If I'm to survive, I'm going to survive as me. Michael Leibowitz. That means with the capacity for rational thought. That means I have to plan long range, because otherwise my immediate actions may undercut my long-term survival, my long-term welfare. So all it means is that I have to survive intact with the methods and the goals and what else does she say? The survival of that are required for the survival of a rational being over the course of a lifespan. Now, what you also went on to say, you said that the task of applying this principle to a concrete, specific purpose belongs to the individual man. Jewel, let me see where it says it. I can't find it, but you talked about basically living a fulfilling life. But what you fail to understand there is that you're not distinguishing between standard and purpose. The standard of ethics is man qua man, which what I just read out to you. The purpose, meaning the reason that I'm willing to do this, is for happiness' sake, to be a satisfied, fulfilled human being. If life was going to be miserable, if the steps that I took to maintain myself were going to harm me physically, mentally, and I was going to be suffering, there would then be no reason for me to do it. It's a distinction between the standard and purpose of ethics. Now, the idea of the initiation of force that you talked about, that it can sometimes be good for a person. Well, for several reasons, I just disagree with this. And this, I think, comes down to why it's important to understand the broader objectivist corpus, in that the objectivist epistemology is one of concept formation, thinking in principle, planning in long range. Now, you might say, well, if I go bash so-and-so's head in, immediately I can get away with it and I can take his loot and run away and buy all these wonderful things, and therefore that money would still be of value. The problem is that there are several things. One, I would be acting with a contradiction because I don't want people doing that to me. I don't want people bashing in my brains and taking my stuff. That's the first thing. Secondly, I put myself in extreme risk from the person whom I'm harming. He might take me out. Secondly, I might get arrested subsequently. But there's something else that I think a lot of people maybe not understand, but I have a special insight to. When you harm physically, when you initiate force against people, what it does to a person psychologically. When I was 14 years old, I committed my first mugging, and I felt guilty about it. But I pushed that guilt out of my head because I knew that was the way I was going to live. That set me on a trajectory that harmed me long term. So I can't just plan my actions based on the range of the moment, whether it be initiating force in the terms of violent assault or even stealing. I'm not walking around with a ring of Gyges on my finger. There's no set of circumstances where I can guarantee I'm going to get away with it. But plus there's the ramifications even if I do. I have to lie to other people. I have to take certain actions to, hide myself, to seclude what I've done. I have to contradict other virtues and values. For instance, the virtue of independence. As I said, objectivism as a whole, I have to plan long range. I have to conceptualize the needs of human survival over the long term. So independence. Well, now I'm dependent on another person to earn my keep because I'm not producing it on my own. There's another one. I'm not being productive if I'm destroying somebody else. So the idea that initiating force can be good or helpful in some way is just not true, not over the long term, and not if one takes into consideration all the requirements of human survival. The argument that you made about the objectivism implying anarchy. Well, here's the problem with that. Objectivism is not a deontological system wherein we say things are intrinsically wrong and they're mandated by some outward force, right? Actions are contextual, and we have to think long range. The entire purpose of politics, the entire purpose of government is to protect human rights. If a situation arises where somebody is such a threat to human rights, whether or not that person has started the initiation of force, for me to prevent them, for instance, if I know somebody has a knife on them that's coming to stab me, I don't have to wait for them to stab me in order for me to restrain them. Similarly, I wouldn't say that people should be allowed to have grenade launchers, rocket launchers, nuclear weapons in their backyard. So somebody might say, well, you're initiating force to stop them. No, I'm using force to stop an obvious threat to the rights of mass amounts of people. Similarly, in the case of anarchy, if we have a minarchist government, a small constitutionally restrained government that is already acting to protect the rights of the people, that's not using compulsory taxation, that's relying on voluntary contributions, or is relying on a lottery or paying for services like you said, if that's the government that we have and somebody wants to initiate an anarchist system wherein they can have their own private defense agencies to compete with our minarchist government, the threat is so great to individual rights that we'd be justified in preventing them. And with that, I think I've taken my 10 minutes and I turn it over to the esteemed Dr. Friedman.
Very good. There are several things wrong with the argument that you have been making. The first is that you want to think in binary rather than probabilistic terms. It is not typically the case that a utilitarian comes to a point where he says, I've got to die in order to promote human happiness. That could happen, but that's pretty rare. But it is very likely that he comes to a point where he says, I can do A, which gives me a 80% chance of survival, or B, which gives you a 78% chance of survival, but B is better for the rest of the world. That is to say, most of the decisions we make, and this is part of what's wrong fundamentally with Rand's talk about that not working for life is working for death. That most of the decisions we make are probabilistic decisions, and that consequently, you have to stay. You usually want to stay alive in order to promote other values, most other values. But if the other value is your objective, you're then willing to accept some trade-off in chance of dying in order to get some of the other one. A whole lot of your arguments against prudent predator are simply saying that the predator must be prudent. Of course, there are risks to violating rights, and it may well be that a prudent predator will end up never violating any rights at all, because there may be no situations where it's an interest to do so. But you keep implicitly assuming that the predator is short range and you are long range. And there's no logical reason why that should be the case. A predator who is prudent will figure out the risk of being caught, the risk that his victim will be in a position to get him, and so forth, and only take actions when allowing for all of those it's worth doing. Your standard versus purpose. There is a name for the philosophy which holds that the objective of life is happiness. It's called hedonism. And you seem to want to go from arguments to claim that the objective of life is that the objective of human action, the values are life, to claiming that it's happiness. Can't be both. Mm-mm. A means cannot trust the end it's for. If you have an argument for hedonism, I have no objection to the claim that it would be no fun to live a miserable life. That's pretty clearly true by definition. But then if that's your argument, you have to have arguments for saying that your pleasure is the appropriate standard, and the objectivist argument claims that your life is the appropriate standard. And if your life is the appropriate standard, then you should try to have a happy life when a happy life results in your life staying alive, and accept the cost of a miserable life if something you do that will keep you alive will make you miserable. So I don't think that really solves any of the solution. With regard to anarchy, it seems to me that your government is a much greater threat than my rights enforcement agency, since your government claims the right to suppress anybody else who engages in retaliatory force, and my rights enforcement agency doesn't. That doesn't even have to be an agency. What basis does your government have if I, as a single individual, engage in retaliatory force for claiming that it can stop me from doing that? It claims the right to do it. Anyway, we'll be going on to limited government versus anarchy in a minute. So I don't have a very clear timing, but I think I'm within my 5 minutes so far. So why don't we? Do we want to do something freer now, or do we want to go on to the second half where I explain why limited government doesn't work?
I just want to respond to what you just said,
sure,
and then we can. So it's not I that am thinking in binaries. Unfortunately, it's you. Because the problem is, when Ayn Rand says, for instance, you're either acting for life or death, she's not saying, if you do this, you're guaranteed to live a long life. And if you do this, you're guaranteed to die immediately. I can eat well and exercise every day of my life and die when I'm 50 of a heart attack. There's no guarantees in this world. There's simply things that we can do to maximize our chances of success. And that's ultimately what she's talking about. In the case of the utilitarian, even if he's taking the risk, by the way, I got the example of him dying, I believe, from you and what you wrote, but I may be misremembering. But nonetheless, even if he's just doing things that are contrary to his interest, that may make him ill, he's still going against his life at that point in order to satisfy the hedonic calculus, where he's going to create the greatest number for the greatest people. Now,
and similarly, when you don't do that, you're going against the happiness of mankind.
Okay, that's fine. That's not my standard, is not the happiness of mankind. Now, this prudent predator, let me tell you, I was in prison for 25 years with a lot of guys who thought that they were the prudent predator, with a lot of guys who thought that they were going to get away with it. It's such a phenomenon that Dr. Stanton Samanow and Samuel Yockelson identified a criminal thinking error called super optimism, where they believe they're going to get away with it. Criminals generally don't think they're going to get caught, or they wouldn't do it. The problem is that the guy you're talking about, this prudent predator, it doesn't exist in reality. When I mean it doesn't exist in reality, isn't that you couldn't find one guy somewhere that might do it. I'm saying that we're not making an ethic to figure out this one guy somewhere who could do it. We're talking about an ethic for everybody. And the ethic that we're talking about for everybody, those types of people generally don't exist. I won't make the absolute statement it couldn't exist, because obviously then one person would show that I'm wrong. The standard purpose hedonism argument you talked about is a deontological argument. You're saying that you have to do what's right, whether it makes you happy or not. That's Kantian duty ethics. It's not objectivism. In objectivism, life is the standard. You select your values according to that standard. When you achieve those values, the necessary result is that you're happy, because that's what happens when we select values and achieve them. We get satisfaction. Life is the standard. The reason that we want to live is because life is enjoyable. If life was miserable, then we would not want to live. And the anarchy argument that you made, again, if you have a government that all it does is protect rights, it's within its orbit, in its right to stop anarchy. Similarly, if you had an anarchist society that was where rights were secure and somebody wanted to start a state, the anarchist would be just in stopping them. And by the way, you didn't address the issue of risk, where if somebody's going to stab me, if somebody wants to have nuclear weapons, bazookas in their yard, whatever, those things are still threats. And with that, Dr. Friedman, we can move on to the next debate, or we can each have another rebuttal here.
I think I had something else I wanted to say. The claim that there is an inconsistency in violating rights when I want my rights preserved. This, as you may know, is Kant's argument. I don't think Rand is a Kantian precisely. That's the categorical imperative, saying that I have to live according to rules which I would want to be universalized. I don't think that either Kant or Rand gives an argument for that. And it is perfectly consistent to say, I want you to respect my rights. I don't want to respect your rights, because my objective is my life, and my life is served by your respecting my rights, and it's usually served by my respecting your rights, but not always. With regard to your super optimism, I would point out that a super optimist in your ideal objectivist society will first lose all the money he has gambling on things that other people want him to believe are profitable gambles and aren't. He will then kill himself by believing somebody who says that the following diet will keep you alive. He will engage in a whole bunch of legitimate moral choices which lead to his death, because being a super optimist, like making any other mistake, leads to incorrect conclusions. That does not follow that the argument that you ought to act according to your own interests, whether or not that serves other people's rights or is only an argument for super optimists. But that's probably enough. I think I've said a little less in my rebuttal than you had in your rebuttal. Let me go on, if it's all right with you, to explain why proprietarian anarchy is better than limited government.
Let's do it.
And let me check the time. So I've got till 10:42 and 46 seconds, according to this. Let me.
I have a clock. You're just not seeing it. I didn't know you
Yes.
couldn't see it, but I see it.
Yes, right. Let me sketch first what I'm proposing. And that is a society where each individual is the customer of a firm which provides the service of protecting his rights and settling his disputes. The obvious problem which Rand, like everybody else, raises is what happens when there's a dispute between two people who are customers of different firms. Don't the firms end up fighting each other? And the answer is that violence is expensive. Having your front yard turned into a free fire zone is not really in the interest of the customers, and that therefore sensible firms will instead agree in advance on private arbitrators, private courts, arbitration agencies, and agree to accept the verdicts of those agencies. The next question is, where does the law come from? And this is, in fact, the largest clear superiority of anarchy to limited government, to any government really, and that is that the arbitration agencies are selling a service to the rights enforcement agencies, the service of providing laws. The rights enforcement agencies are selling a service to their customers, which includes both the rules that the customers will be under because of the agreements of the rights enforcement agencies and the service of actually enforcing those rules. It is therefore in the interest of the rights enforcement agencies to try to have legal rules that their customers like, in economic terms, economically efficient legal rules that maximize the welfare of their customers. And if I had more than 10 minutes, I would go into much more detail on that, but I'm not going to. People can find it in my book. And that's what the rights enforcement agencies, so it pays the arbitration agencies to produce such law. Therefore, you will have a tendency to produce those laws, those legal rules that maximize the welfare of the people they affect. Liberty works. That is to say, on the whole, rights respecting rules increase human happiness, human welfare. It is very rarely the case that it is worth more to me to be able to violate your rights than it is to you to have your rights not violated. Hence, the legal rules produced by this system are going to tend to be libertarian rules as well as economically efficient rules. This is, in a sense, the most obvious advantage over limited government. Your claim that your government respects rights is an assumption. That's an argument by definition. It does not give us any reason to believe that an actual government will behave that way, and we have quite a lot of evidence that actual governments don't. That in the jargon of my field, your limited government is not incentive compatible. It is not a system where the people making decisions, the judges, the police officers, the voters, have an incentive to act in the way you want them to act. Presumably, you agree with me that if governments produce cars and food, we are likely to have expensive cars that don't work very well and are at risk of famine. Producing law is not an easier project than producing a car. As anybody who's actually been to law school or been involved in the legal system realizes, although it's easy to make sort of simple statements of what the law should be, once you get to actually applying them, to figuring out what should be the penalties, what should be the standards of proof, what counts as breaking a contract, a whole bunch of other things, producing law is a complicated project. And it is a project which will be done badly by a government and better by a market. So the basic argument is the standard pro-market argument applied to producing law as well. As far as I can tell, the only answer that objectivists give to the question, why will your system, well, there are really two arguments that objectivists seem to give to why will your system be rights respecting. One of them is the argument by definition. We define a limited government as one that respects rights. which unfortunately does not tell you that you could actually have such a thing. This reminds me of one of the arguments for the existence of God that you may be familiar with, that we define God as a being, as the greatest being that could exist, a being with all virtues. Since existence is a virtue, therefore God exists. And that demonstrates that you have defined an existing God. It doesn't demonstrate that God exists. Similarly, if you define your limited government in that way, as a government that doesn't respect rights, that tells us what you want, but it doesn't tell us that there's any way of getting it. That after all, lots of governments claim to respect rights. The other alternative is sort of like the communist solution. The communist solution is you have to have everybody believe in communism, and the objectivist solution is we have everybody believe in objectivism. Once everybody believes in objectivism, there will be no votes for violating rights. And unfortunately, first, even if that's true, there will still be room for disagreement. And in fact, people act relatively few people act in ways that injure themselves because they think it's morally right. That on the whole, insofar as people have it as a predictable pattern to human behavior, it's the pattern of acting in your own interest, acting to achieve your objectives. And unfortunately, within the political structure, no way has been discovered of making that lead to the outcome you want, to good government. That limited government, after all, is an experiment we've tried multiple times, not with objectivists, but with ordinary people who were in favor of it. And the government of the US and the UK in the 19th century spent about 10% of national income, most of that in the US case at the local level. Currently, it's about 40% in the US, I think higher than that in the UK. So it does not seem to me that there's any evidence that the institutions we're familiar with will generate will generate the outcome that you want. And I'm arguing that the institutions that I am proposing will. Now, I should say, I am not as certain that my system works as you are that your system works. I discuss in my book various ways in which my system might break down, and they're all possible ways. So whether the system works is going to depend on, in particular, whether the equilibrium number of rights enforcement agencies is large enough so that you don't get a cartel reinventing government. But there are some other conditions, but that's the largest one. And there are respects in which its laws, the legal rules are going to be suboptimal, and I've discussed those in some detail. But nonetheless, it is a system in which individual self-interest has a predictable tendency to generate the kind of legal rules we want. And as far as I know, no political system has yet been proposed which has that characteristic. So that's the basic argument against limited government, unlimited government, against the alternatives to anarchy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. First, I am not optimistic at all that what I'm advocating will ever take shape, nor am I optimistic that an anarchist system will ever take shape. The bottom line is, for whatever system we're going to have, a large number of people have to be convinced of its merits. Not all of them, but enough that you can implement it. Now, you mentioned rights a few times, and you mentioned it in your book. You mentioned self-government, you mentioned rights, but what you don't do is tie those very ethical concepts to a broader ethical theory, which leads me to wonder what is the nature of these rights you're talking about? From whence do they come? You talked about that it would likely be a libertarian society under anarchy, but you rightly say maybe it's not. You also said that we've tried limited government and it failed. First, the limited government did fail to stay limited. There's no doubt about that. However, we do have a higher standard of living that was ever imaginable. We have had a large amount of liberties for a long period of time that were unfathomable in the past. even though it's suboptimal in the way that you put it. And the interesting thing is that idea of that, what that convinced me of that was a conversation I had with you years ago when I booked you for a friend of mine's talk show. And I made the comment about how bad things were due to government. And you said, no, actually, let's not exaggerate. They're not that bad. Right. So it's true that we've tried limited government and we haven't resulted in a purely libertarian society, but your claim that under anarchy it would is also disputed by the facts. The vaunted Iceland, which you, of course, brought to the world's attention in the 70s, I believe, where they were very analogous or very close to what we would call anarcho-capitalism. Not exact, but it was close to anarchic society with defense agencies. And as Mark Wiener pointed out in his studies, yes, they had order, but no, they did not have freedom. Vincent Galloso, in his studies of anarchic systems, says, yes, they can work for a period of time, but it's an unstable equilibrium because they're subject to being conquered, in which case they either create a state on their own or they get invaded and taken over by another state. The point about that these organizations will give customers the laws they want, that isn't a virtue, that's a problem. And it's a problem because if I don't want to belong to an organization that doesn't support the laws I want, I simply go find another. And there's no reason to think, in the absence of a large state to prevent it, that you won't end up with a defense agency for criminals, which we of course have had, which is the mafia. The difference is that the mafia was put out of business by a very large federal government that doing things that the anarchists would never allow or support. So if you have and like you said, it's competition. So if you have criminals that are willing to pay for this defense service, they're going to get it. It's going to be a mafia. But the simple logic of the anarcho-capitalist system just doesn't work for me. Suppose I live in an area, and my area that I live in, there's multiple defense agencies around me, and they've all passed laws against drugs, including drugs on the highways. Well, how then do I get the drugs to my house when I want to use them? It's clearly my right to do so, but these other agencies are preventing me. Now I can either have my agency go fight with them. Taking them to court won't do because they have the law, or I can just go without the drugs, which they're preventing me. But there's also other issues, and it has to do with the laws. And I've had people say, well, you're going to have a higher court to decide it, but courts decide based on law. So if I have multiple defense agencies that say that intellectual property is bunk, intellectual property is a rights violation, we are not going to defend that. And you have another defense agency that says, yes, intellectual property is a right. You have a right to the ideas that you create. So I go and hire that defense agency. Now somebody from one of these other agencies rips off my music or rips off my book or rips off my movie. Now I want to sue. I want to go to this arbitrator. On what law does the arbitrator decide? Does the arbitrator decide based on the laws of the defense agencies who are opposed to IP, or does the arbitrator decide based on mine? How do you resolve this? Another situation that always comes up is the age of consent for sex. If one guy belongs to an organization that says the age of consent is 18, another guy belongs to one that's 16, the guy whose organization says it's 16, his son has sex with a 16-year-old girl from the other agency. That guy says, my daughter's been raped. I want this guy arrested. This defense agency says, oh, no, it's not rape. Our consent is 16. What law does the arbitrator use to decide the case? We don't know. And finally, if you've got two guys and they're in the road and they're fighting it out on the street, I look out my window and I want to report it. Do I report it to my agency? Do I report it to one of those guys' agencies, to the street owner's agency, to the establishment's agency? And what about all the other people that are on the street? Whom do they report it to? They are going to go to their agency, the street's agency. Each establishment, I'm assuming, has a different owner. Plus, the guy who starts the fight, he may say, well, damn, I'm getting my ass kicked now. I'm calling my agency. The other guy calls his agency. I call mine. All these agencies come. We have no idea who has jurisdiction and who has authority. And I have no idea how you're going to resolve that. And all of those things, all of those problems just don't go away. And it doesn't have to be a result of anybody being dishonest, of anybody lying, of anybody hiring an agency that they don't agree with. And the point about competition is important because these agencies are going to do everything they can to represent the people who pay them. So if I believe my intellectual property, to go back to that, is being violated, my defense agency best not sell me out or else they're going to lose customers. And I've only taken a little over 5 minutes, but I think that's enough, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. To begin with, we could have an argument, we could have a debate over my ethical theory, but that would be a very different debate.
Sure.
And I've discussed that at some length, and I do not claim to have as strong arguments for mine as objectivists think they have for theirs, but then I started out by trying to show that the objectivist arguments were wrong. I agree that indeed government has not prevented us from all progress. The question is whether we are worse off because of the things the government has done or better off. I agree that there is no guarantee that a anarchist system would be stable. Iceland, which I usually refer to as a semi-state, is a stateless society because there was a single law code, lasted about 300 years. About 200 years before serious problems started to develop. That's better than the U.S. has done. The U.S. was in a civil war within a century of its founding, a very bloody civil war, and at this point is very far from its original system. So I don't think one has ways in which one has a guarantee that something will be stable forever. I only claim that under some plausible circumstances, my system would work, and that if my system worked, it would be superior to your system. And I think that's the most that I'm willing to claim. But the fundamental mistake in your critique of my system is that you don't understand it, that you're missing the fact that every pair of agencies that expect to interact have contracted in advance on an arbitration agency. So that means that if I'm a criminal who wants an agency which will allow me to commit crimes, that agency has got to persuade all the other agencies it can interact with on terms on which they are willing to agree to an arbitration agency that allows me to murder them. And since the value to the murderer of being able to murder somebody is generally a great deal less than the value to his victim of not getting murdered, you are not going to end up with that agreement. That the basic logic of the system is one in which the rules between any pair of agencies are those rules that maximize the welfare of their customers, both sets of customers, because in order for me to provide the service that my customers want, I've got to have contracts with the other agencies that they might interact with. Consequently, your imaginary criminal agency ends up fighting a war against everybody else and loses because nobody else will agree to the terms that it wants. With regard to your point about drugs, my claim is not that you will get a perfectly libertarian society. I don't think you can predict that. My claim is only that you have more reason to expect libertarian laws than any other set of institutions short of reviving Ayn Rand and making her dictator. And I don't know of any way that she could actually be a successful dictator. Therefore, if enough people believe that drug use is a horrible thing, you're going to get agreements banning drug use. They will probably be agreements that try to minimize the damage done by banning drug use, because doing that will make it cheaper for agencies to get the agreement of agencies that would like to represent drug users. But you could get that. However, under the same circumstances, if everybody is sure that drugs are a horrible thing, your system will do it too. Because in your system, somebody will come up with some argument for saying that the use of, in fact, you could do it very easily. You've just told me that my having an agency which engages in retaliatory force, that can be suppressed because it might It might result in rights violations. Well, my taking heroin might result in rights violations. I might end up being so addicted to it that I need to steal to get it. I might, if not heroin, but some drugs, I might go crazy. So it will be easy enough in a society where people are against drugs to come up with arguments for imposing those rules in your society as well. Anyway, I think that more or less covers the mafia. The actual mafia was in Italy, not America. That's a term which is and it has not really been successfully suppressed, although it's been knocked down to varying degrees. What else did I want to say? I think that's probably enough things that I've said, and we're in fact under an hour for the whole thing, which is.
And I've got my response. So first of all, of course, under my system, people can go against libertarianism. I was simply responding to your claim that anarchy would be libertarian or likely would be libertarian. Also, you said that I'm not understanding your system. I understand that I don't think it would work. I don't think that would happen. The idea that all these organizations, separate organizations, are going to agree to arbitration under the same laws.
Oh, not under the same laws. Every pair of them agree to arbitration under the same laws.
Sure.
This is a pairwise contract.
Sure. And if we fundamentally disagree on what the law should be, as in the case of IP is just one example, then we don't have an agreement. And then what would we do in that situation?
Because the value of getting the law I want is not infinite. So that I, as a customer, as an author, would like IP laws. You, as a reader, perhaps mistakenly would like to not have IP laws. So the question is, how much is it worth to me to get the laws I want, which will be reflected in how much more I'm willing to pay a rights enforcement agency that provides them, and how much more is it worth to you to get the laws you want? And then our agencies can bargain over what terms they will agree to. And they have an incentive to reach the agreement that maximizes the combined welfare, and that may include side payments. It may be that they will have that the agency which gets its way on this issue will have to give way on some other issue, or will have to agree to some financial arrangement. But it's not as if a significant number of people regard it getting their way infinitely valuable. And therefore, you will end up with an outcome which reflects the values of everybody.
Dr. Friedman, I'm afraid you're guilty of what you accused me of. When I said that a minimalist government would have the right to prevent anarchy, I wasn't saying that such a thing would happen. I was showing that it's not necessarily a contradiction within Rand's system to prevent anarchy. What you've just done is basically said by definition, this is what's going to happen. And what I'm saying is that is a hell of an assumption. And it's
not an assumption. It's a conclusion. It may be an incorrect conclusion.
No. You said it will happen, Dr. Friedman.
Argument.
Dr. Friedman, you said it will happen. It's an assumption of what will come. It hasn't happened. It's a prediction at best.
Is the prediction. That's
correct. And what I'm saying is that the idea that all of that order is going to come, where people are going to give up the laws that they hold to be near and dear. Creators are going to say, well, negotiate my IP. Parents are going to say, okay, well, if my 16-year-old daughter has sex, so be it. Those are just two examples, but there's many more that I'm sure that we could come up with if we sat here. My whole point is that the idea, like Rothbard, for instance, and I know you're not a Rothbardian, said they're all going to be governed by libertarian law. Well, fine. I mean, if I'm going to assert that everybody's going to be governed by libertarian law, then okay, you win. And it's the same thing. If I'm going to assume that all these organizations are going to come together and make agreements, then yes, okay.
I'm not assuming it.
But I don't believe that.
I'm starting with the normal economic assumptions of people acting in their rational self-interest. And I am then saying it will be in the rational self-interest of agencies to try to figure out what rules maximize their revenue from selling the service they're selling. It is in the rational self-interest of individual customers to choose agencies according to whether the bundle of things, of services they're providing, which includes what legal rule they'll settle their disputes under, maximizes their welfare. So I am not I'm assuming it only in the sense that it is the system I'm defending, not in the sense that I assume it will act in the way I will act. I conclude that it will act in the way I claim it will act on economic grounds. On economic grounds, I also conclude there are some circumstances in which it won't. In particular, as you may know, I argue that even if IP law is desirable, you probably won't get it under my system for reasons I go. This is a case of market failure on the market for law, that I don't believe that markets always give the best outcome for cars or food or anything else, merely that producing things on a market gives you better odds of getting a good outcome than any alternative method. So that's the basic point I'm making. One other thing I wanted to say, though, because I thought it was sort of amusing and it occurred to me.
Can you hold that for 1 second?
Sure.
I just want to point out that what you've done is introduced Homo economicus into this equation.
Correct.
Which the idea that everybody is just this maximizer. And first of all, I think that's wrong. But secondly, the idea that it would not be in somebody's interest to have their intellectual property protected, I think is not the correct conclusion. But go ahead. Go ahead. And what was the thing? I'm sorry to interrupt. What was the thing that you wanted to?
What I wanted to say was that if you put together the two debates we've been having, one way you can read it is that if you end up agreeing with the prudent predator argument, you can then justify limited government. You can then say that your limited government is indeed prudent predation, that your limited government now is going to have taxes probably. But the argument is to say that it is in my interest, once you believe that anarchy won't work, which you believe, you can then say, all right, I agree that I should violate rights a little bit, because violating rights a little bit will result in a better outcome for my life and my happiness and all the things that objectives are in favor of. So therefore, if you put together my two critiques and ignore my arguments for why anarchy works better than limited government, you've got a defense for your political conclusions. And I should say, it is not too far from my beliefs. That is to say, as I think made clear, I don't think that anarchy will work under all imaginable circumstances. And I do not believe, unlike what Rothbard claims to believe, that the non-aggression principle is an absolute rule. That my view is that respecting rights is a value. It's an important thing. You ought to do it if you can, but not a value you're willing to sacrifice anything at all to. And therefore, from my standpoint, the best you can do if you can't make something like my anarchy function is indeed a little bit of rights violation in order to maintain a hopefully not too horrible government. So that's the position that I think objectivists ought to hold, except that unfortunately, I think there are holes earlier in the argument, which I've already discussed. But anyway, that struck me as an interesting point.
Dr. Friedman, I just want to commend, as an aside, your intellectual honesty and the fact that your pursuit of truth, you're not a flamethrower. You're not a guy that's ideology over everything. It's all about pursuing the logic and truth of the argument. And that's something I truly respect about you. I wanted to ask you a question before we wrap up. There was quite the argument on my feed the other day about whether or not you were an anarchist. And one of the claims made, and I think they woefully misunderstood your point, but I'm going to give you a chance to answer it. When you say that it very well might happen under anarchy, that there's laws against drugs, right? They were assuming that you were saying that you would be fine with that as long as it arose under an anarchic system. My personal belief is that you weren't making a normative judgment. You were simply saying that this is a distinct possibility that this happens.
Right. That's correct. That is to say, I would say that such laws are still rights violations. Given the opportunity, I wouldn't report you for your heroin use. Assuming you use heroin. For all I know, you have different preferences. But I unfortunately don't know a way of creating a society that's guaranteed to be perfect in every respect. Similarly, as I said, I expect that under the system that I've proposed, there will be some ways in which the laws are not optimal. That there are a number of issues, air pollution is one of them, and intellectual property is another, where the law between you and me affects him. And since your agency and my agency are bargaining in terms of the interest of their customers, they won't take that into account, and that might have bad results. So I don't believe I'm not a utopian in that sense.
Yeah.
You
Neither am I.
Rothbard, and in a sense, my most fundamental theoretical disagreement with Rothbard is the point that I made in disagreeing with objectivism, namely that you need a incentive to produce the laws you want. That Rothbard, as far as I can tell, does the same thing objectivists do. He basically says the reason we'll get a libertarian society is to first persuade everybody to be a libertarian. And the objectivists say the reason we'll get a libertarian society is we first persuade everybody to be an objectivist.
Objectivists don't say that, Dr. Friedman.
But that's the argument.
No, what we say is that the only way, and by the way, Mises said the same thing, that majorities govern. Ultimately, you have to convince a majority of the people or a very strong vocal minority, whatever it is that you want to happen. That's just seems to be a fact.
Yeah, I don't think it's a fact, actually. I think that people are much more inclined to go along with whatever they see as the existing institutions. But there are lots of ways in which I think a majority of the U.S. does not approve of all of the features of the U.S. government, and that would be a much more complicated argument. But there was something else I wanted to say, but I've now forgotten what it is, so we could leave that for a later conversation.
I want to tell you something else. The first economics book I ever read, of many, many while I was in prison, was Free to Choose. Free to Choose made me love economics. The reasoning in the book was just phenomenal. I really enjoyed it. And despite later disagreements that I have in relation to monetary policy, it's still one of my all-time favorites. Dr. Friedman.
So what is your preferred monetary policy?
I think that there's no perfect monetary policy. I would prefer gold standard, free banking. Something along the lines of which Mises.
As far as I know, my father's view on free banking was that there was no particular reason why government should create money, but that at the moment it did, and therefore that was the system he wanted to analyze.
Yes.
I want to go back to your point about Homo economicus, because my claim is not that it perfectly describes human behavior, but that it does a better job of describing predictable behavior than anything else we have, and that the alternative, which it seems to me you're offering, is some kind of a Homo philosophicus, in which once you have the knockdown philosophical argument that shows you should never violate rights, that's it. Not everybody, a majority of people will be persuaded by that argument, and therefore, even if they see a good opportunity to violate the rights of somebody they don't give a damn for in a way that will benefit them, they won't do it.
No, that's not my belief at all. There's a difference between prescriptive and descriptive. I'm saying, according to ethics, what people ought to do. What they will do is a matter of, whatever they choose. And when I say the majority of people, I'm talking about to get the type of government that we want. They might adopt that type of government for different reasons. They might be utilitarians. They might, follow Mike Humer and be intuitionists. They might follow Ayn Rand, but the majority ultimately have to agree, or a very strong minority, vocal, that are adamant, have to agree in order to have any type of system. That's all I'm saying.
But I'm basing my predictions of how my system, if established, would work on the economic assumptions about human behavior. And it seems to me that you're basing your prediction of how your system, once established, would work on the philosophical alternative namely that the way you're going to get a majority of people to go along with never violating rights is to make a philosophical argument.
You're not going to get the majority of people. That's not my argument to never violate rights. I'm talking about what the government's job will be, that the government's job will be to protect rights. Somebody may be inconsistent and say, yes, I want a government that's going to protect rights. And then that person goes out and violates rights anyway.
He doesn't have to violate rights individually. He will sensibly, being a prudent predator, use the government to violate rights. That's much safer. After all, we observe lots of examples of that.
He might, but I would argue then he's not homo economicus anyway, because he's not understanding the implications of the policies that he's advocating.
You're missing the fact, the fact that the political system is ripe with market failure. That is to say, the individual who lobbies to get a tariff for his industry correctly believes that he'll be better off with that tariff. He, of course, will argue against tariffs for other industries, but that's consistent. He's acting for his own interest in both cases. Similarly, for lots of other things, once you have a monopoly government, it is an obvious tool to use to transfer money from somebody else to you. And therefore, you can expect that to happen, as it has happened repeatedly in the past. But anyway, that's probably enough of this. We should probably let
Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. Oh, I want you to tell people where they can find you.
Oh, right. My webpage is www.daviddfriedman.com. You need the D because I applied for the thing some months after somebody else did. So www.daviddfriedman.com. I have a Substack which comes out every 3 days on a wide variety of different topics. And if you go to my webpage, you can find both a link to the Substack and a link to a list of past Substack posts sorted by topic. And if you're really curious, there's a search window where a search bar where you can put in anything you like, and it will search my Substacks, my old blog, and my writing to see what I said about that subject. So I take advantage of modern technology. I should say I didn't design that search window myself. Somebody else pointed me at some place that I could copy it from, and so forth. And I should say that I, in fact, do not enforce IP very carefully on my own work, because I write mainly in order to spread ideas, not in order to get paid. And I should also say that IP is increasingly becoming unenforceable for technological reasons, and therefore people are having to find other ways of getting rewarded for creating it. But that's another separate issue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedman.
Thank you. It was fun.
It was. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.